So let me begin by saying that the recent 40-day war and the June 2025 12-day war were clearly wars of aggression of imperialist nature against Iran. In both occasions, America and Israel attacked Iran without any provocations on the Iranian side, and in the middle of Iran's negotiations with the USA. This was clearly registered, this war, that the incentive is for Israel to pursue its greater Israel project. To push through this project, a weak or failed state in Iran was ideal. Previously, this was achieved in the countries that had not submitted to US-Israel policies, Libya and Syria, Iraq, and even Lebanon. So if we notice, since its foundation, Israel has been working on weakening the surrounding states one by one. The collapse of the Soviet Union allowed greater leeway for the Israelis to continue with their long-term plan of destabilizing the region. The previous military campaigns by the US were masqueraded as the humanitarian intervention. The result was catastrophic conditions in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Now, with the Trump administration in power, this was a historic moment for Israel and the USA to impose a war against Iran, which was the only country in West Asia, in addition to Turkey, that has retained its state power and independence. So we can now make a number of observations. The war was not intended for regime change, although such an outcome would have served USA and Israel very well. The war was not really about Iran's nuclear program, nor about its defensive missile capability. The war was certainly not for liberating Iranians. It simply meant to destabilize the country and bring it to an internal or economic collapse. Israel would ultimately like to see a weak or failed state and possibly a balkanized Iran that it could influence. That's a great question. This whole curious discourse was the handiwork of a certain mysteriously funded Persian expat media that have been hard at work for at least a decade, over a decade in fact, romanticizing the pre-1979 Iran and promoting the son of deposed Shah, Reza Pahlavi, who has lived the last 47 years in exile without a profession or a political party, feeding off the extensive wealth his family had stolen from Iran. So the idea of liberating Iranians through a war imposed by foreign powers practically means denying agency to Iranian people and regard the Iranians as a people who are incapable of fighting for their own future. It is an insult to 120 years of Iranian social movements and activism. But the greater insult, in my view, which is in tandem with denying Iranians agency, is seeing the Iranians as instruments of regime change. In this context, as if beckoned by foreign powers, Reza Pahlavi called on Iranians to take it to the streets on January 8 and 9 of 2026 and take over government buildings. He insisted, echoing President Trump, that help was on the way. Up to that point, Iranians have been peacefully protesting inflation in the streets for about 10 days. Mr. Pahlavi's announcement literally turned the protests into a violent uprising, which was alien to the nature of Iranian protest movements in the past several decades. The outcome of such an irresponsible call by Mr. Pahlavi was catastrophic, as a huge number of protesters, as we know, were shot or arrested. I mention this to show clearly how foreign powers can manipulate the people's justified grievances for their geopolitical gains. The Iranian people have been struggling for justice and freedom since the constitutional revolution of 1906. Each generation has come up with its own ideas and momentum and challenged the existing order. Iranians do not need liberation by someone else. They are completely capable of fighting for their own causes. So the fact that the aggressors intentionally destroyed Iran's infrastructure and killed school children and civilians tells us clearly that this war was not meant to be a humanitarian intervention or a war for the liberation of the Iranians. This is a great question. So the countries of global south are going to analyze and learn from Iran's sustained resistance against the United States and Israel, two of the greatest armies in the world. So that's one thing that foreign observers will learn from this conflict. For Iran to win this war, it just needed to retaliate the military strikes and not to surrender while taking a lot of damage to the country's civilian structure. This means that the USA and Israel literally lost the war because they could not achieve regime change, weaken the state, or balkanize the country. I'm not a military expert or analyst or international relations theorist, but it is clear to me that in the years to come, countries in the global south will start emulating the way Iran fought this war. I think new forms of alliances against the empire will form. We already have economic alliances such as BRICS, so I won't be surprised if new alliances are formed in the years to come in various capacities and through various pacts among the states, especially in West Asia. On the other hand, everybody knows that developing military capability will impose economic hardship on people. That is why, in response to your previous question, I mentioned that the struggle against the American and European empire and their satellites, of course, must come with a full-fledged policy of social justice enhancing programs. The best example of social justice in the global south that is also ecologist in nature and anti-imperialist is Colombia under the democratically elected president Gustavo Petro. He's visionary and he's an internationalist. So in my view, we are gonna countries in the global south are gonna learn how to defend themselves from this conflict, and they will also be able to form and imagine new alliances. And my emphasis here is these alliances and these formations must have a very strong element of social justice and ecology. So that's a really good question, because Iran's entry into political modernity is marked with the constitutional revolution of 1906, as we all know. This was Asia's first democratic revolution. It was not only a revolution against traditional autocracy and for a parliament, but also an anti-colonial struggle for Iran's independence from Russian and British imperialisms at the time. After the dictatorship of Reza Shah, who reigned between 1925 and 1941, came to an end, and he was forced into abdication by British, who, along with the Soviets, had occupied Iran in 1941, the country saw, and that's ironic, a historical period of restarting the democratic project that was left behind. Political parties, free press, labor unions flourished. Mohammad Reza Shah was too young, and his hold on power was still precarious at this time. At this time, we have the first emergence of leftist politics on mass scale. And I just want to mention that the Federation of the Unions of the Workers' Unions at the time had about 300,000 membership, which was the largest union in Asia, if I'm not mistaken. In the early 1950s, nationalist leader Dr. Peyman Vahabzadeh was democratically elected as the prime minister. He nationalized the Iranian oil that was controlled by the British. This was the height of Iran's anti-colonial, anti-imperialist moment. As we know, the CIA and MI6 coup d'etat removed Mossadegh in August 1953, and the Shah returned with a heavy hand. Iran plunged into another brutal dictatorship. But I have already spoken about the rise of anti-imperialist intellectuals in the 1960s and 70s in my work. So let me just say that these intellectuals in those decades, they raised consciousness about the realities of colonialism and imperialism and tried to challenge the state dictatorship. This decade, 1960s, is indeed one of the most amazing times in Iranian histories. Political life in the 1970s Iran was defined by urban guerrilla activism that was in both its Marxist and Muslim tendencies, anti-imperialist, anti-dictatorship, and internationalist. The guerrillas are known for their solidarity with Vietnam and Palestine, reaching out to Latin American revolutionaries and participating in Palestinian liberation and the liberation war in Darfur. In this context, the revolution of 1979 was indeed a revolution against the Shah's dependency on the United States. I have called the Iranian Revolution the world's last classical revolution. The emerging ruling clerics after the revolution were explicitly anti-American, and the years after the revolution, Iran supported many liberation movements in the region. Although the left emerged strong after the revolution due to severe state repression and internal splits, it was effectively weakened in the 1980s. My point in narrating this long history is to draw your attention that in the past 120 years, the idea of resisting colonial and imperialist world order in various expressions and movements has been present in Iran. Of course, we should remember that on its own, anti-imperialism could easily translate into gestures of defiance without much substance. The colonial movements and resistance against imperialism becomes meaningful and life-enhancing only if they uphold principles of social justice and democratic participation. So, well, let me just say that aside from my theoretical work, my areas of empirical study in Iran is the intellectual history and political movements of the 1960s and 70s. These are the decades of, gradually understanding the post-1953 situation in the country in terms of dependency and dictatorship. What was significant in the intellectual and political circles of the 1960s and 70s was that resistance to neocolonialism and imperialism must come with a progressive program of social justice. In fact, one of the main contentions of the activists and intellectuals of this time was that Iran's development worked against the people's well-being and only benefited a royal family and a ruling elite that basically fed off the state's developmental plans. One of the unfortunate phenomena of our current age is the detachment of anti-imperialism from social justice. For instance, we saw how in Venezuela, Chavez's idea of the Bolivarian revolution against American imperialism deteriorated, in fact, under US sanctions into a corrupt state under Maduro that impoverished the population. This is also the unfortunate outcome for Iran. So the lesson, to summarize it, the lesson from the 1970s, 1960s Iran is this. Only a sustained, meaningful, participatory social justice program around the country can make resistance to American and European empires effective and liberating. The conference of left and progressive world leaders in Barcelona right now in April 2026, invited by Spanish President Pedro Sanchez, is a great example of how such progressive alliances can emerge. Thank you for this great question. In fact, I can challenge a number of myths, but let me just here focus on one, because I was thinking about the U.S. and Israel attack on Iran and something and its consequences for, in fact, for Americans, for Europeans, and for the rest of the world. Economic consequence and the consequence in terms of shortage of oil and petroleum products. So I came up with this idea. When the US and Israel attacked Iran, they had no idea that they would encounter a fierce and cleverly calculated military resistance by the Iranian state. So America and Israel were literally defeated, if you like, by Iran because they could not achieve their military objectives. And that fact exposes a number of, dominant myths, but I'll focus on one. Let us recall that Iran was sanctioned by the United States and Europeans in the past 4 decades, severely sanctioned in the past 20 years or so. The sanctions in turn made the everyday life of Iranian people very difficult due to soaring inflation, among other things. It also, sanctions always create corruption. So it also created corruption in terms of exchange of money and movement of, merchandise and so on across borders. So in this context, Iran's counterattack against US bases in the region that involved 8 countries around Persian Gulf in the war, and Iran's closing of the Strait of Hormuz showed that a country that is geostrategically located and has developed state-of-the-art defensive systems can impose severe economic consequences on the rest of the world. This is exactly what Iranians achieved in this war. Iran turned aggression against Iran into a global economic crisis. In a way, Iran brought the hardships sustained by Iranians back to the world in terms of rising fuel prices and subsequent rising prices of food, heat, fertilizers, and transportation. Among other things, this experience showed that the American empire is falling in this multipolar world, and I emphasize multipolar world. Iran busted the myth that only America and Europe can impose sanctions on a country. But here, I would like to propose a concept as a result of these observations. I call it reverse sanctioning. When one country besieged by sanctions and by European and American arrogance, of course, mobilizes its hold on global energy and trade routes and imposes serious and long-term economic crisis for the rest of the world. So I think one of the theoretical consequences, if you like, of this conflict was the concept of reverse sanctioning. And maybe in the future, we will be able to see reverse sanctioning by an alliance of states in the global south against the empire. But we'll see how that goes. Thank you.